donde para pasar hay un puntero.
I can sit there too.
Sí. So you have the pass to the right. Go back the next one.
Okay.
We're going to wait still.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Yes. Thank you. Bueno. Buenos días a todos, buenas tardes ahora ya, a partir de las 12 estamos iniciando la tarde. Hoy es un día muy bonito, muy importante para la Escuela de Arquitectura de Granada, por muchas razones, ¿no? La principal es que hemos recibido la visita de Stephen Holl y Dimitra Tsachrelia, y vamos a intentar hacer una jornada doble, ¿no? Primero habrá una conferencia de Dimitra sobre un tema que es Architectonics of Music, que ella está investigando desde hace tiempo como profesora de la Universidad de Columbia. Stephen Holl dará una lección magistral esta tarde a las 6 en el aula magna, con lo cual es un día de alegría para esta Escuela de Arquitectura de Granada, que recibe a estas dos personas tan importantes. Para nosotros realmente es una apuesta de, sobre todo, bueno, pues tener y situar a la Escuela de Granada en un panorama nacional e internacional con estas dos conferencias. Y es un placer tener a Dimitra y Steven con nosotros, y esperemos que disfrutemos mucho de su conferencia. Dimitra es socia de Stephen Holl Architects, donde ha contribuido a una serie de diseños tanto académicos como profesionales de 2008, donde se unió a la oficina de Hudson Valley desde 2016. Ella lidera varios diseños del estudio, el House en Hudson, en Nueva York, actualmente en construcción, o el estudio de artistas GSAPP en Westchester, New York. Realmente ha coordinado varios edificios y la investigación y el archivo de Hudson Valley en 2019 y su ampliación en 2023. La ampliación de Castle Creek, y ha dirigido varios proyectos de investigación y desarrollo como la Ex-In-House. A nivel internacional dirigió también el concurso para la sala de concert Janacek en Ostrava, que está ahora realmente en ejecución, y dentro de 3 años se terminará de construir. También ha diseñado y coordinó el lanzamiento de la exposición de Stephen Holl, Making Architecture. Dimitra Tsachrelia recibió su diploma, estudió en Grecia, en Patras, en la Universidad de Patras, y después fue a Estados Unidos para hacer el máster avanzado de proyectos en la Universidad de Columbia en The Grados School of Architecture Planning and Preservation. cuando obtuvo con honores este máster en 2008. Desde ese momento enseña como profesor asistente, como he dicho, en el taller de Stephen Holl, y se licenció también como arquitecta en Estados Unidos, y es también Green Associate Lead. Realmente ella también dirige como la fundación Stephen Myron Holl, y donde va a desarrollar realmente varios proyectos, y la idea es que tanto Steven como Dimitra han venido con estudiantes de la Universidad de Columbia, porque van a desarrollar un proyecto en un lugar dirigido a esta temática, ¿no?, de arquitectura, Architectonics of Music, que va hoy a mostrarnos en su investigación y en tu planteamiento. Con lo cual, para nosotros es un gran honor teneros aquí con nosotros, y sois bienvenidos, y muchas gracias por venir. Cuando quieras, puedes ser.
Yeah. You can hear me well? All right. Thank you very much for inviting us here today. Thank you all for making the time to come and listen to the subject of the architectonics of music. We're very fortunate to be in this beautiful place. We just came from the Manuel de Falla house and auditorium, so trying to understand the culture here, and the music of this place was really beautiful. I'm going to discuss a subject that has a lot of material, so bear with me while we go through this, and I believe it's going to make all sense at the end. Stephen introduced this subject in 1989, and we have taught since then 10 studios together at Columbia University. What is the architectonics of music? It's a way to think about design starting from musical ideas. So how is a composer's thinking? How is a composer's approach? And how can music be a heuristic device, a way of introducing architectural thought? Because there is a lot of parallels between music and architecture. So it is not the musicality of architecture, right? I'm not going to speak today about acoustics or the auditoriums, which is a whole subject on its own. We don't have time for this today. But I will discuss 3 areas in this talk. Is this working? Maybe this way.
I will pass.
Pass? Yeah. So, music notation is an interesting subject to think about when we speak about ideas. How do composers write down their ideas, and how can that inform the language of architecture in music? Because that's how we think, that's how we create architecture language, through notation. And there is a particular period in music where notation break ground in a lot of fronts, so I will speak a lot about this, especially graphic notation. The proportion and material for music is very much the sound, the harmony, the dissonance, the materiality of which sound is made. And then I will finish with the kind of some ideas of for the synthesis of the arts. How is music affiliated with poets, artists? How can the arts together work to create a bigger whole? And starting with notation, this is Stockhausen, and I will present mostly composers who broke ground in the mid-50s and created a breakthrough of what music theory was supposed to be, and try to break with, you see a graphic notation of his here. How can we have a more flexible syntax? How can we have a larger vocabulary just through notation? How can we disobey the laws of music theory that was governed all the way through that time? So if you go to the next, just to give you a little bit of a picture of the school of Darmstadt, go to the next one, that created a breakthrough with what is called as forbiddingly dense music, really dense in meaning, really dense in concepts and ideas. And the idea is what we're after, in a way, because I think it's important to be able to speak through and understand what the meaning is of the designs we're trying to accomplish. So it's also a way to work through intuition and introduce variables in the notations and in the music of the time that really broke ground. And here's Stockhausen.
That was written up to since 1951 was explicit spirit of non-figurative composition. We tried to avoid all figures that were recurring, which means all repetitions. And through this, something became very clear, that the way sounds were organizing themselves, or were organized, was the most important.
So this is Stockhausen gave many lectures in London. They're very interesting to listen to, but the question of form or non-form or formalism or figurative music is basically trying to get away from realism into another form or meaning, multiple meanings, for example, double meanings. The less realism, the more thought, right? The more open into conceptual thought. And it, of course, overlapped with the time in art, with abstract expressionism, with a lot of artists at the time in New York and elsewhere that went together into this movement. I don't know where architecture was and how it can join into that movement or not. It's just a thought for a discussion. But if you go to the next one, this is one of his graphic notations, Stockhausen, 1955, thinking about a score of music very far away from the idea of the staff notation, grouping the notes into, he actually called it groups, group forms and collective form. Here, an interesting story is that about 20 years later, he confessed that the shape of this outer boundary was directly influenced by him looking at the mountains of the Alps, the Parspel Mountains. So how can we communicate with a flat drawing, like the architectural drawing, that then translates into multiple dimensions? And during this discussion, I will have some sounds that we can also hear of what this kind of music sounded like. But I want to also break into some architectural concepts and projects that Stephen has led. I'm going to go into Stephen's brain a little bit and explain the kind of creative process. If you go to the next one, for example, you see the influence of that graphic notation, where kind of Stephen takes that creative freedom to speak about those shapes, not as the music notation directly, but as those shapes shaping voids. That was an entry for a competition in 1994 in Munich, in Germany, that was basically taking over a whole urban block, filling it in where it needed to be filled in. And so you see that urban block as a kind of enters from the idea of the mountains, the idea of the shaped voids into the block. There is other interesting ideas here that come into play. I will describe each of those projects very briefly, just focusing on the musical ideas. I'm not going to try to give you an overview of the whole project. But how do the idea of the mountains and the voids relate to this urban frame that supports the building? So more sketches of that idea. And if you go to the next one, the shapes took form in plan rather than elevation to allow this coexistence between the old and the new. And in this sketch you also see another introduction of another composition by Stockhausen called 7 2D, the 7 days. And that tries to bring in the idea of time. If you look at this next notation, this is a piece of music written by Stockhausen called intuitive music. Here they abandoned the idea of music notation altogether and use language itself to speak about play a sound, play it for so long until you feel that you should stop. It introduces the idea of duration. And that, I think, works very well within that understanding of an urban block. How would that work 7 days a week? How would there be, and Stephen had a whole concept of different transient, semi-transient, of permanent residents, people who would use it at different times and activate it throughout its use. And you see here how the concept of the music notation was translated in plan, and there's a lot of other levels to it, and how light comes into play that informs that project. At the same period, 1969, John Cage, which was a very important figure, compiled notations by composers into this book called Notations. And this page on the left is from that book. It's a composition by Anhalt, who made an orchestra so large that the piece could never be performed. In fact, he said that he wanted the musicians to practice and rehearse for 50 hours before they could even play on the stage. The piece was never performed. But graphically, the idea of the symphony of the modules works within that idea of the group that Stockhausen also introduced. Was an interesting concept for a building that was realized in Korea. It's a house and a gallery. And if you go to the next one, you will see again this transfer from a music notation to an architectural plan, which seems to be very straightforward and direct. The idea of the staff notation is translated into beams of light. So there is a creative freedom with the starting point of this musical notation that then works with the element of the water, through which also light penetrates. And the plan is interesting because the project works on two levels. So the water combines the spaces underneath, and this is an idea that we could also discuss later, the idea of those pavilions, what seem to be pavilions floating in space, actually are all connected underneath. So if you look at the section, and here you can see the water element and the space coming through one unit. So all of those separate elements are in fact all connected to shape a whole. And then a lot of interesting things happen when you introduce light through water. So the idea of innovation and creative freedom, I believe, is encouraged by the fact that you could get an inspiration from a piece of music. And a lot of more details, materials, that became an architectural drawing on its own, right? For the fountain that is embedded on the facade. There is many composers that work with that idea of graphic notation. Cornelius Cordu is yet one of them. They composed orchestras like the Scratch Orchestra who performed this music. Some of the musicians were not even expected to have music education. So really trying to break what the language is and how we can free it to thinking about invention, thinking about chance. And the next one is another of his drawings that was a reference for yet another competition that Stephen entered in 1989 for the Tolbiac railways in Paris. Just to give you a sense of the breadth of the subject, the notation that our students do also over the years are direct responses to a piece of music or working through a composer's work to connect to their creations. You can show the next one as well. I think this was a reference to the sounding of the room composition, musical composition. Xenakis also broke ground. I don't know how many of you know these composers. Yannis Xenakis proposed, let's read, he proposed the word of sound masses, groups of sound events. He broke really the idea of time and how do we understand sound, and how do we realize it through what he called the stochastic music. So a different order. We speak about density, we speak about probability, we speak about laws of physics that inform musical composition. His music is very, very dense. This is one of his graphic notations for pithoprakta. It's about movement. Like in architecture, the body moving through space, here too, the sound moves in space. You can go to the next. This one is called akoripsis, and it literally means jets of sound. So imagine sound passing by, sound coming through in speeds or in different volumes and densities. Each of those numbers represent different densities. That's a musical score. It was an inspiration for a group of students who showed their work in 2017. In fact, Jacobo is here in Madrid, and you can see the parallels, trying to understand the volume and the size of those events, what they were called musical events, to inform the architecture. The next one, you can hear the violins coming up into a mass event. The sound is quite low here, but it's okay. It's a very breathtaking composition. This is a piece that I worked on in 2008 as a student at Columbia University. How do you translate mass of sound into a massive material that still allows light to come through? And it's about this event, right? A shock that is forceful when one hears it, like a thunder. It connects to sounds that are not imposed or not controlled by the scales that are refined, through, for example, Bach did the well-tempered clavier, right? He controlled what the melodical sound should be and the theme. Here, nature itself is an inspiration. So if you go to the next one, there is a glissando here that may play. I don't know if it will play. Click on it again, maybe. Or Gershwin, a little bit earlier in that period, his music, this is a big glissando that goes up. The glissando here also informs geometry. So you could see it as a scale going up, as a sweep. And if you go to the next one, it informed one of the pavilions at the Kennedy Center that we opened in 2020 in Washington, D.C. If you go to the next one, here you can also see, I get the idea of, it was a competition to add to an existing Edward Royal Stone building, which was massive. But the addition, we wanted to be pavilions in a field. This is one of the largest green roofs in Washington, D.C. And so the field in those pavilions, each one have their own kind of expression. And I'm only going to describe this one that has the sweep. This is a performing arts center. It's a very important institution in America that they needed more rehearsal space. The big block houses the performing auditoriums and orchestras. So that sweep is a simple gesture, but it's actually not easy to achieve architecturally. If you go to the next one, it's quite a significant curve. It kind of escalates as you kind of pass through the space. And it suggests also that something is happening down below. This kind of space comes from down below. So the whole idea is how can we move from an object, understanding architecture as an object, to a field. It's a field of happenings rather than front-facing objects. So, and we can move on. I'll be happy to speak about each of those projects later on as well. You see it realized here. We called it the Glissandi Pavilion. They call it the Music or Events Pavilion. But yeah. Music notation had several breakthroughs. I'm mostly focusing here on a specific time in the mid-1950s. But the Guidonian hand was a device that was developed and invented by Guido of Arezzo to remember as a mnemonic device. It was, how do we remember music? How can we remember to sing those hymns in the masses? And if you go to the next one, these were using notation that called neumes. And we went yesterday at the cathedral and we saw these incredible pages, huge. Remember, we looked at them yesterday of the neume notations in the cathedral here. And they didn't have rhythm yet. They didn't have, it was a very early on way to represent music, but it was a real breakthrough, also what was called Ars Nova in the 14th century, of trying to annotate music. This also often had color. And if you go to the next one, if you take this Guidonian hand sideways and expand it, it was the predecessor of the staff notation in music as well. It became an inspiration for a building in London, the Maggie's Cancer Care Centre, which is a building where they wanted to help the patients to feel human in the space that's not a hospital. It's a place that's meant to welcome you, to make you feel comfortable. And so the neume on its own, the word neume means in Greek, pneuma, the breath. So you could say the breath of life, the breath of the voice. And it seemed very appropriate also in that context of the medieval town in London, next to the chapels there, to bring those two together. So it's a small project, but I think the idea of bringing the color through the glass, it's a little bit like a Mark Rothko painting. It kind of blurs out, and it was really an innovative way to do curved glass, frosted glass in color. And in the nighttime it glows, but in the day you don't see the color on the outside. It shines through to the inside and it activates that space in very unpredictable ways. The people who we visited just last year, and the psychologists who work there said that we welcome the patients, we give them an introduction, and the building does the rest of the work for us, because it really surrounds you. Another project that works between color, notation, structure, and form is the Safarstraat project that was an addition to an existing building in Amsterdam. And there was work done at the existing, but I'm only going to focus on this addition, which, if you go to the next slide, was a simple cube. But the team there with Stephen worked with the idea of chance, and John Cage is a composer who pioneered this whole method of choosing chance, not leaving things up to a random, but allowing for unpredictability in the music composition. So non-deterministic, indeterminate music. The facade, they had a color dice that was thrown onto the drawings of the elevation that determined where those colors are, so they are off, from where the openings are. Of course, that was fine-tuned later. I will speak about proportions in a minute. But it also had a relevance to this notation by Morton Feldman, which is one of the graphic scores he made early on, inspired and with John Cage. He showed him how to use the rapidograph, the architectural pen, to draw this. And here, what is time? Can it be represented with space? So each of those blocks represent time, but they're drawn in space. Another composition that is referenced here as well is Patterns in a Chromatic Field. That was a composition from 1981. It's a very long piece. And the concept behind this idea of movement, how do you describe time? How do you describe movement? What is scale in music or in architecture? There is an idea that the parts don't add up to the sum. There is something beyond the parts. So there is not a regular deterministic way of thinking, but there is something that happens beyond what is suggested by the piece of music itself. And here, what we hear, in fact, is not directional. The music is not leading. We could have heard a longer piece of that, but it's drifting. The music doesn't lead you somewhere. The music keeps you in a state of constant change, but yet without a resolution, right? And so it kind of works, I think, very well with the idea of reflection in architecture, how the building is actually performed through the use and how it shows its use when the lights and the different colored lights are reflected on the water, and it speaks about how it's being used. So again, it's not the plastic experience, as Feldman said. It's not about creating an object. It's not about creating a painting. It's about the creative act. It's about the experience of it happening. And he also was very deeply influenced by rugs, the Asian rugs, and the way that they were made. Each one of those is a repeated piece of a composition, but each of one is different, and especially because it was dyed by hand. So no red is the same, no shape is exactly the same. Therefore, we're not talking about a pattern. We're talking about a field. So how can we think about the concept rather than the composition, the process rather than the object, perception rather than experience, and where does that lead us? Keep going to the next. Some of those have become rugs and creations that Stephen has done through the watercolors we use. We love to design all elements in the space, especially rugs and things that you touch and you sit on can also be inspired by music. So to close this kind of chapter of notation, the ideas is something we strive for, right? They lie beyond the bounds of experience. Bergson said that the act of perception outruns perception itself. So is it that it requires, I think, a very conscious being, a very presence to walk through those spaces of the architecture that we're trying to explore in the studio and in practice, like that music would do. So if you go to the next one, proportion and material, Bela Bartok tried to, and here I'm going to speak about structure of music and the material of music, meaning sound. What kind of sound are we opening, did these composers open us to? Not the well-tempered clavier, not the music that we knew for 250 years since Bach wrote that, the tempered clavier, but open to folk music, for example, open to the sounds that have a dissonance, that the composer's ear was trained to forget to some degree. So if you go to the next one, this is a kind of equation that Stephen wrote. Is the material and sound over time equals material light in space. You can read this in many different ways, that sound in space equals light in time. And the question is, how can we open up what kind of sounds, what kind of light? Is there a distinction between sound and noise, for example? That's the idea that John Cage introduced. But here, to stay with Bela Bartok for one more composition for strings and celeste, he used a theme here that is repeated and altered throughout the piece. And it has a fugue, so there is a concept of stretto, and a stretto means repeating a theme and not playing it against each other. Bartok also had a very interesting idea on how to arrange the players on the stage. So it had an actual material proposition of where do you place the instruments on the stage, the strings, the light, and the heavy. And he made it much more clear, this kind of idea of antiphony. One speaks, the stretto continues, there is a dialogue there, and the heavy in the back. So the whole composition was an inspiration for a house that Stephen designed in 1991. And some of our students also work with this idea this semester, the heavy and the light. And these roof structures, this lightweight roof, are kind of playing over those spatial dams, that the heavy elements. And there is a graphic notation here as well that you could see overlapping with the, like a section, right? And if you go to the next one as well, this is by the composition, the notation is by Paul Klee, transcribing one of Bach's sonatas in his pedagogical notebooks. Paul Klee, I think, was great in trying to understand music and notation and art. So we can look through those images, but they were based, and so was Bartok's piece, on very clearly defined system, harmonious system. Especially if you go to the next one, the Fibonacci sequence, and there has been incredible analysis on the particulars for this piece. I think it's a genius on using the Pythagorean sequence. And the architecture, of course, also uses its own proportional system. And sometimes I think in today's education, proportional systems are a little bit forgotten. It takes a little bit of skill to understand what a good proportion space is. We've seen very many beautiful spaces here in Granada. But it's the ordering of the piece that gives it the structure. And so if you go to the next one, so the materiality in music is kind of conveyed as a temporal experience. And you could say that the structure is a spatial experience. So they kind of work in parallel. Here you see the bent tubes that support this, the roofs. Another sketch that I like very much of this project is an earlier sketch before the roofs were actually defined. But if you zoom into the top left here in the next slide, I think Stephen kind of has this understanding that a sustained mathematical ordering and a chance ordering would still not add up. Like what I was saying earlier with Feldman's piece, what is there that allows this broader understanding of architecture? And it's light as well. This is one of our students' work here, working with Tomás Marco, a Spanish composer, thinking about that idea of dissonance, the ordering, the harmony. Harmony is something that has changed over time as well. We know that in the Aristotelian times, the Pythagorean tuning was very different than what we conceive today as harmonious. They thought that the second, not the third, was harmony. So if you hear what they thought was harmonious, is completely different in today's ear. I can go on with that, but I also want to bring back Karl Stockhausen again. This is a piece called Stimmung, and this is for voice. And so there, the harmony comes from the overtone syncing. So the overtones, the bass tones, and the higher tones together make this whole sound. If you go to the next one, you can hear a little piece of it. And you can go to the next. Trying to understand that in graphic notation, and with our students' work in the next one as well. It's about each of those individuals contributing with their voice to a broader harmony. And so it's about the piece and the whole. So if you go to the next one, there is another interpretation by another group of students. There they worked with Narcaro, and the ideas though are very similar. How can we use blocks of notes? How can we use very simple notes and create a whole? And that also informed another competition that we did not win, but I think it's interesting to discuss, the Klanghaus. That was a project in the Alps. You can go to the next one in Switzerland. Out in a beautiful landscape, there was a musician who wanted to communicate the importance of the Alpensong, the yodeling, the cowbells, this kind of music that was very important regionally. But it used those kind of sounds are a version of an overtone syncing. There is a way there that Karl Stockhausen, through his compositions, brings in the kinds of sounds that we hear here. So Stephen introduced this concept as a way to say it's a universal language music. So if something that the Alp horn and the yodeling that happens in this region could be understood universally through the idea of overtone syncing. Then together with the landscape, it works as a whole. And here again, the architecture is not an object, it's a field, it's a place you walk through, and you understand it also as it is connected underground as well. You can go to the next one. What Pauline Oliveros did is also on a similar kind of line. She influenced very many composers of the time. Take a walk at night, walk so silently that the bottoms of your feet become ears. She had a series of sonic meditations, what they call, this one is called Native. It's trying to, I think, take a step beyond experience into consciousness. And I gave this talk, the subject underneath music, architectonics of music, correlations, because what is our relationship to space? What is our relationship to ourselves? How do we understand light? What is the deeper kind of idea of consciousness? How conscious are we of the sounds we make? She actually moved beyond the idea of material and what is sound, what is material, right? Is the space itself here. The space itself receives the sound, and it's rather than emanating the sound, it receives it, and that's what we hear. That's what we use then as composers. That's what we compose with. Like the Aeolian harp in Greece was an instrument that the wind blew through it, and that it produced sound that way. So I think I have a clip of her speaking, if it plays. Maybe you have to click on it.
Remarkable 45-second reverberation time.
That's the sound that this space created, that cave.
Townsend, Washington State, where the three of us played the music that is sounding now. The meme, deep listening, occurred to me after our recording in the cistern. we had come there to experience the unusual sound. Recording was really an afterthought that resulted in the release of Deep Listening by New Albion Records in 1989.
So here is the idea of the they went down into this cave, into this cistern, and recorded the sound that they created very spontaneously. But she also, if you go to the next one,
remarkable 45-second reverberation time in the Dan Harpole cistern in Port Townsend, Washington State.
You're playing
where
it.
The three of us played.
Keep going to the next one. I think you don't need to play it. That's also one of her notations, the infinite and the zero. I could love my listening. I could listen to me listening. I could perform my listening. I could be my listening. And that's where the idea of consciousness comes in. How is the space, the sound? How do we as architects experience or design space? And here also I want to speak about John Luther Adams. Two of our teams are working with his ideas. He's very much in that line of being. He created a piece up in Alaska that is using data streams of the Science Center recording the seismic movement of the Earth. And that also together with sound, data streams that come through the movement of sunlight, the time of the day. So you have some of the sounds that are predictable, like the day will pass, and some that aren't, like an earthquake that can be very like a kind of mutter, or a drum, like it can be really loud. And it creates a sonic geography. It creates a piece that's really unpredictable and predictable, but it's about being. If you go to the next one, this is one of our group's work from this semester. Life emerged from the sea, so we might quite again ourselves become ocean. That song, that piece, it's called Become Ocean. It's part of a trilogy that is Become River, Become Ocean, and the next one, Become Desert, is the work by Abdullah and Shize here. So from the ontological to the ecological, from object to ecology. And also another thing that was interesting here with Luther Adams is how can you make music outdoors? And that it actually brings a broader understanding of what a musical polyphony is. If you allow this whole ecosystem of sounds to be part of the musical composition. And to end this chapter with Varese, The Liberation of Sound is a piece that he contributed to this magazine 391 that was run by Picabia in early 1917 here. And it speaks about our musical alphabet is poor and illogical. Music, which should pulsate with life, needs new means of expression. So what is it? What is our language? What is our vocabulary? So the synthesis of the arts, just to end with opening it up a little bit to collaboration. You could call it synesthesis of the arts as well. And John Cage was great in introducing other sounds, working with other composers, artists at the time, poets. The next slide is one of those kind of synesthetic experiences where, I don't know if you've heard of this pavilion that was built in 58 with Xenakis and Corbusier in collaboration. Corbusier, if you go to the next one, drew the plan of it looking like a stomach. You come in and you're digested and you're exiting. And Xenakis brought in his idea of this, the glissandi. And if you go to the next one, you will see those glissandi. That's from the piece Metastasis. We played a little bit of the parabolic curve. That curve that kind of connects that plan shape into a three-dimensional form. And we can play a little bit of it. It was taken down after the fair, but it was an experience that Xenakis made a piece for at the introduction of it, and then Varese had the main piece with the video projection. This is the piece that you heard when you came into the pavilion. I don't know if you know what that sound is or if you can guess. This is recorded sound of burning charcoal that he created. And here it's a picture of one of our students' work. And you can go to the next one. And that's what you would see inside with 425 speakers. It was an environment that was created. Debussy, I understood Emmanuel Tefera was also, the fellow was affiliated with Debussy. He said music is the arithmetic of sound, then optics is the geometry of light. And here the two are working together. You can go to the next one. Messiaen is very much known for his synesthetic experience of bringing light and color into musical composition. He kind of continues a stream of experimentation that happened early on, and I have a picture of some of these early color organs by Wallace Remington. There's a whole study that was happening early on in the 1800s of trying to connect sound to color, which really influenced Scriabin. I think Scriabin might be known for his compositions. This is a performance that just started yesterday in the Symphony Hall in San Francisco, where they used Scriabin's color sound experience and introduced smell as well. So the experimentation continues, and pieces of the early 1900s continue to inspire and create new experiences for audiences. If we have a little time, do we have a little time? Yes, I can play a piece of composition with a collaboration with the dancer Jessica Lang that we worked with. This is a small sample of it, but it was made in 4 parts: under the ground, in the ground, on and over the ground. So we use the kind of architectural thinking to work through the choreography, and you can play a little piece of that if it wants to play. It's okay. The concept there was to use color at the very end of the performance. So all of the 3 parts are all black and white. The dancers are in black and white, and then at the end there is this explosion of color. It's okay. The last kind of point I wanted to make is about the individual and the collective. This is a sketch from a project that was finished recently at the Princeton University for space for music, theater, and poetry literature. So how do you organize the individual rehearsal, the individual working with a collective in music? I think this is particularly important because the composer needs the orchestra to perform their piece, and the kind of connection between them, I think, is also important in architecture. Here you see this project. It's called the Lewis Center for the Arts. The building for music is to the right, theater and literature in the back. They're all connected underground as well. And you see, of course, the concepts here with the big space of light coming in underneath, then joining all of them. The proportions always in our work, working with the Fibonacci sequence, fine-tuning it, and the building that I wanted to show you is the music building, because it works from that sketch of the individual and the collective. And those boxes of space that are literally hanging from the ceiling were realized quite. You can see to the next one here during construction, and the next one, I think here you can see them from the inside. And below them is that space of the collective rehearsals and performance practice. You can see also the relationship to the street. People can look in and out and across. Yeah. So you see the project there, and as it reflects with water. I don't know if the video will play here. It does. Okay. One of our students' work earlier on was working with the composition of Xenakis. I think it's interesting to think about those individual rooms and boxes of sounds and light. And just to end with one slide here that we were discussing yesterday with Stephen and you, Alejandro, of the orchestra playing when the Titanic sank. This is a snippet from that film, 1958. What is the creative act, right, against the ruin of the world? So they chose to continue playing when the Titanic sank. And as architects, I think we do too have a responsibility to continue our creative act. Luther Adams also was an activist, actually, and decided to focus on his composition because he says music matters today more than anything. I cannot do politics, I cannot do activism, but I can do, my contribution is the music. And so we do as architects have a responsibility as well.
Thank you so much.
You.
Thank you so much, Dimitra, for this great lecture. We open the terms of the question and answers. Si queréis preguntar algo, es el momento para poder preguntar algo a Dimitra.
Quick question. Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for coming.
Thank you for making the time to be here today.
It's so good for us, you know. Yeah. You've been talking about music, Stephen Holl, and you've been researching for a long time. You were saying 10 years.
30 years. 10 studios. Stephen has been doing it for 30 years. Me, yes, over 10 years. And actually, in fact, 15 years when I first did the first studio as a student at Columbia University. And we've been continuing to teach together recurringly.
When we listen to music, I'm thinking about composers. They try to people to experience, to enter in a certain mood.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And if you have to speak about Stephen Holl's architecture, what sort of mood do you think he tries to breathe?
To breathe. I first of all, I'm not sure I agree with composers trying to bring in a mood, because if it's your own mood actually that influences. You can hear the same piece of music many times, and the way you feel makes you relate to that piece of music differently. You can hear the same piece of music in a very melancholic moment or at a very happy moment, and you relate to it differently. I think that Stephen's architecture is a very optimistic architecture. It has optimism. And I think that optimism comes through the use of light and proportion. Like Lucan said, it's when the light hit the wall that, I'm paraphrasing, when the light hit the wall, it became architecture. Yeah. And so that kind of idea of the moment that we realize, or these different moments that the architect is able to give as part of that experience, they can be dismissed, or you may go there at night and it's a different moment. So you have to come back, I think, to a building and experience it differently every time. Does that help the reading?
So do you think it depends more on the people?
Yeah, I think.
Experience than
Yeah.
Yes, another question there.
Congratulations. It is all about translation. It's all about translation from notation, the shapes of notations, into the variable forms and volumes of architecture. And from the variables of music, from the variables of architecture. This is almost a translation.
It's a translation, not always from the graphic notation. Sometimes it's the ideas themselves. Sometimes it's a title of a musical piece. The patterns in a chromatic field. It's a title. It's not the notation that was a connection there, but it is a translation of those ideas, transferring ideas from music into architecture, as a starting point, as a springboard. How can you start composition or a design freely, and not always come with the kind of an idea that we as architects are here to resolve problems or to solve problems or to respond to a program, like the Alhambra. We were seeing the Alhambra yesterday. These spaces were multifunctional. They were great in their own proportions in their space, and the use came in to complement that, of course, and to be experienced. But the architect didn't come in there to solve a problem of use. Came more free-minded, and so that's the kind of challenge here. And I think pedagogically, as professors, what can we bring to our students? What can we bring to academia to help free the mind? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It was pretty interesting. It was very profound research in architectural music. Probably following the train of thoughts of the previous question and being in an academic environment, we have some experience with the students. You say it's difficult to have approach music, architecture, and these scenes.
Yeah.
So the question is more like a methodological question. Is there, when it comes to your teaching, is there any specific methodology? Because at the end of the day, we are talking about two different notational systems, two ways of registering information. One is the architectural one, which probably is much more closer to what we understand of the realities, and the music one is probably rational. And I think, at least in my experience, when you try with the students, there's always about how you start giving this process of hybridization of mixing of these two notational systems. So it's more like a curiosity. There's a specific methodology.
It's more like you open the door to something unexpected to happen. Because, sometimes and oftentimes the students never heard of Stockhausen, never heard those kinds of compositions. So that's the first step, to say, here, there is a kind of music that tries to experiment with time and space and open that door. And sometimes I think it's the misinterpretation that leads to creative freedom. So we are not trying to teach music, we're trying to give influences. And some of the students have music knowledge, some don't. Some of the composers didn't even need musicians to play their composition. So it's really, doesn't mean you need to become a musician. It's more about opening that door and letting them experiment. And oftentimes a misinterpretation of a piece leads to very interesting results. We have our reviews with composers. Rafael Mustel, the composer, has been teaching with us for a long time. Other composers have come over time, and they bring in their expertise to help understand a piece of music and help understand some of those what is dissonance, trying to understand and open up this discussion. But then it's also graduate students that we teach, so there is an expectation that they are advanced, they can do design, so they can be free to work.
More questions?
You said at the very beginning that you were not really talking about acoustics, but since you create a space and this space has an acoustics, is it something you find some links to where the inspiration came from the composers? So does the acoustics in the room find any link with something like that?
The acoustics is a very difficult physics problem to make a good acoustical space. The orchestra, we do the orchestra space in Ostrava, has a link to Janacek's compositions, who was a composer there. His kind of idea of music is translated into the paneling system of the auditorium, but that doesn't translate into acoustics. It's the shape of the room that matters. It's a whole different subject, and I don't have the time. I didn't have the time to talk about it today. But we just went to this theater, the auditorium at the
Manuel de Falla.
That I hear is a perfectly acoustical space. So it's a science on its own to understand mathematics, curves, form, space, materials. But here I wanted to focus more on this sounding of the spaces themselves, discovered spaces, the cistern resonating and reverberance there is really what makes that space. The Chapel of St. Ignatius has a great reverberation. So sometimes you wanted the reverberation in a space for ecclesiastical music, for example, or chamber music. And sometimes you want the clarity of the sound. So it's a very complex subject. It's a big topic.
I understand, but since your inspiration comes from music, you have aesthetics. So my question was like, this aesthetic is somehow reflected in the acoustics that comes out, and it makes it a proper space to interpret this kind of music there. Or there's no link at all. As far as I understand, when you answer now, there's basically no link. The inspiration comes, and if you want the acoustic, you have to do different things.
The form that you give is the acoustics also, in the end. You don't try the acoustics is not an afterthought. It comes with the design of the space. I think the Chapel of St. Ignatius is a great example where the curves of the ceiling focus where does the space focus, right? Focus below the ground, so you cannot hear your echo, and let the spaces speak for themselves in the end, right? Some museum spaces have echo. We created a small house. We called it the Explorations of Inn, and you enter through a sphere. It's a small space, but it's a carved out sphere, and you can hear your own sound, your own voice when you speak, and it creates a very interesting surprise to all the visitors because it engages all your senses. You smell, it's all wooden inside. You smell, you can touch the wood, you see the space opening up, and all of a sudden, I hear my voice. And so that's we did not know exactly how that would happen. We didn't expect that to happen, but it's a very welcoming event, right? So the space will surprise you. You cannot control it all, except if it's an auditorium, if it's a concert space, where you really have to control it the best you can. Yeah.
Are there more questions? So thank you so much again for this great lecture. And we are very happy to be here with you and Steven. Thank you. Bravo, bravo.